novelists, poets, artists, musicians were all or are all on our side. And now, if you do an internet search for any such person, you will find an article about them, hosted by the site Countercurrents. And that article will be the best ever article about them. And that website is all down to our next speaker, Greg Johnson.
Thank you all for coming out. If there's anybody in the back who can't hear me, just put your hand up to your ear and I'll adjust. Okay? So anyway, Jez, everybody who's involved at the London Forum putting this on, thank you very much. I've put on conferences before and I know what a headache it is, how stressful it is. And when I came here last September, I was so impressed. I came back here not to speak but to listen because I want to meet and talk to as many people in the British movement as I can. Hugh and I are conducting interviews with people. We interviewed Martin Webster till he was just exhausted yesterday, 2 hours. And we're going to meet John Bean, and we're going to meet other people. And I just want to learn how you all do it, because you do so well compared to what's happening in the United States. And one of the goals is to return to the United States, and before I leave the New York City area where I have been living for about a year, I want there to be a New York forum that's just as vibrant and popular and useful as the London Forum. So that's one of my goals. If you go to the Countercurrents website today, the top article is a piece by Colin Liddell called "The Need for German Moral Rearmament." That really is a nice way of summarizing what the mission of Countercurrents is in general. The mission is white moral rearmament. So if you want to follow Countercurrents, just go to the website, you can sign up and you'll be given an email every time a new piece is published. That means 15 to 20 things a week will be coming into your inbox. In primarily English, but a lot of other languages as well. We have a global network now, and I have people who write for me, translate for me in every European nation and every European colonial nation, every European capital. It's an amazing network of people and a great community. But as Mark said, it's important to get it offline and into the real world, and places like the London Forum are a model for where we can all beam in to the real world and interact with one another. So thank you again. I spoke last time on a very esoteric topic, Jean-Baptiste Vico, and I promised Jez to do something more accessible and popular and inspirational, and so I'm going to do something on Gotthold Ephraim Lessing. Hurrah, yes. Gotthold Ephraim Lessing was a German philosopher, playwright, and essayist. He was born 1729, died in 1781 at the height of his powers, at the height of his creative powers. He was also a Freemason. And Lessing apparently had high hopes for Freemasonry, but he rapidly became disillusioned. And in 1776 and 1777, he composed a work called Ernst and Falk, Dialogues for Freemasons. In the dialogues, I believe that the character of Falk expresses Lessing's own ideal version of Freemasonry, while the experiences of Ernst represent Lessing's disappointments with the real thing, namely its snobbishness and its occultism. Falk does, however, manage to defend a kind of Freemasonry from Ernst's objections, but Falk explicitly states that he thinks that joining a Masonic lodge is actually a bad thing. Okay? He says, no good man should join a Masonic lodge, he says. It's a bad idea. And he was disappointed that his friend actually joined it based on the things that he had said about Freemasonry. So this is not your father's Freemasonry that Lessing is defending or talking about here. Okay? It's something entirely different. It is anti-egalitarian. It is politically conservative. Specifically, it's conservative of distinct historical identities and nations. And it's based on eternal principles of natural law, which can be known by reason, as opposed to a mystical tradition passed along through initiation. Now, most writers today regard Freemasonry as a subversive institution opposed to Christianity, monarchy, and nationalism, and promoting secularism, republicanism, and globalism. Now, I think most of us, though, if we lived in the 18th century, when churches could have people persecuted for heresy and where there were absolute monarchs, I think most of us in this room would actually be leftists at the time. I know I would be. And so to some extent, I applaud the efforts of people like Lessing and others to create conditions of religious toleration. constitutional monarchy or other forms of constitutional government. I think that was a good thing. And I also applaud Freemasonry's influence in the quest for transnational institutions that can help mediate conflicts between different states and avoid or abbreviate the scourge of war. I think those are good things. However, I'm a nationalist, and that means I'm opposed to globalization, meaning any kind of one world government scheme or one world economic system, because of the destructive consequences that these things inevitably have, namely the homogenization of culture, the breakdown of borders, the mixture of races. Those are all bad things. Thus, I was delighted when I read Lessing's Ernst and Falk to find a conception of Freemasonry that explicitly rejects global government and wishes to conserve the differences between different nations and states, while remaining fully cognizant that we need institutions to prevent those differences from turning into hatred and bloodshed. This is a conception of Freemasonry that can help reconcile competing tendencies within our movement, within the New Right, which is really divided between advocates of petty nationalism, in quote, petty nationalism, small state nationalism, and those who envision what I call grandiose nationalism, the idea of a politically unified Europe from Iceland to Vladivostok, right? Those are two different camps, and each one has a valid set of concerns, and I think that Lessing's idea of a conservative Freemasonry actually provides us with some useful ideas for mediating those differences, and so I think it's quite relevant. Now, Lessing argues in Ernst and Falk that even if a single best constitution could be invented, that it would not imply a single world government. Such a government would be impossible to administer, he says, and therefore power would have to devolve upon smaller units. Now, this is so far so good, right? This is textbook political realism, conservatism. It's not some kind of one world utopian scheme. Then Lessing goes on to state that the natural units of political order are ethnic states. He talks about the English, the French, the Swedes, the Russians, and the Spaniards. He recognizes that there are real differences between nations. He thinks that these differences can be in part explained by differences of climate and geography. And this means that their constitutions and their ways of life, their cultures, would become differentiated as well. So even if you started out with a single best form of government and Xeroxed it, passed it out to everyone, within a generation or so, everybody would have different laws and different customs, because there are different peoples. Again, as a rightist, this sounds reasonable to me, right? We believe that the best, most harmonious, well-functioning societies are racially, culturally, linguistically homogeneous. Okay? We believe that the best... We're clapping for Lessing now, no? Okay. We believe that the best constitution is not a one-size-fits-all totalitarian boiler suit, right? It's a unique garment tailored to fit the distinct genius of each people. But Lessing is also realistic about the problems with ethno-nationalism. Ethnicity, he says, may unify a state, but it does so at the expense of dividing states from one another, laying the foundation for distrust and discord. We who think that Germans and Italians and Englishmen have too much in common to risk shedding one another's blood, lament strife amongst our peoples. And we think that there has to be some sort of supra-political or trans-political order to mediate disputes amongst us and to coordinate our relations with other racial and civilizational blocs like Islam, India, Africa, China, and so forth. Lessing furthermore recognizes that mankind will always have different religions. They're not going to disappear anytime soon, and although religion can unify a people, again, it does so at the expense of dividing it from other religious communities, which lays the foundation for strife. And finally, Lessing recognizes that within each political community, individuals are divided from one another by differences of power and wealth. He says that there will always be a distinction between ruler and ruled. This is classic political realism, right? Aristotle talks about this. There will always be rulers, and there will always be people who are ruled. There will be people who naturally need others to tell them what to do, and there will be people who can rule themselves and rule others. People are not equal this way. He also says that there will be differences of wealth and poverty. He explicitly says that if we divided up all the wealth equally within 2 generations, because people aren't equal, there would be rich and poor again. And again, this lays the groundwork for strife. Strife between ruler and ruled, between rich and poor. And so we have to find ways of mediating these conflicts. Falk puts it this way, and this is Lessing speaking as the character Falk in his dialogue. He says, the means for uniting human beings, for assuring their happiness through association, also divide them. But the health of every state requires forms of unity. And therefore, for every state to be healthy, there's always the risk of conflict with other states because of the differences that inevitably exist. In the 20th century, Carl Schmitt, the German political theorist, talks about the concept of the political, and he says that the political is inseparable from the fact that there is real diversity among people, and real diversity means that there will be always a possibility for conflict, existential conflict, conflict where blood is shed. And so Lessing is, on this point, indistinguishable from one of the great rightist political theorists of the 20th century, namely Schmitt. Now, the duty of every good statesman is to protect the interests of his or her people. The duty of every pious believer is to be concerned with the interests of his or her faith community. The duty of every good father is to look out for the interests of his family. So far, so good. We can all understand that. But what if destructive conflicts emerge between states or families or religions? Those particular duties are not enough to resolve conflict. And therefore, Lessing says, there have to be people who go above and beyond their particular duties to reach out to one another and establish a new form of concord based on an appeal to a higher good. There are higher goods than partial goods. For instance, if you think about the conflicts between the French and the Germans, there is a higher good that can resolve that conflict, namely recognizing that we all belong to the same race and civilization. But in order to establish that kind of mediation, we have to have people who are beholden to that higher good and are not just narrow partisans of their particular interests. And that is what Lessing says Freemasonry is. He says that Freemasonry, the goal of Freemasonry, as he puts it in a riddle, is to make all those things that are called good deeds superfluous. Now that is a riddle. What does he mean by that? And he says making good deeds superfluous is the most good deed of all, the most superlatively good deed of all. Well, he's saying that the good deeds that you want to make superfluous are the necessity of going above and beyond your duty, right, to have peace with other nations, right? He says that the purpose of Freemasonry is to make it the duty of a specific group of people to serve the common good or the good of the whole, rather than particular goods. And therefore, nobody has to go above and beyond their duty because there are people who make it their duty to think about human solidarity, to think about the common good in the most embracing sense. Now, Lessing says that Freemasonry, as he defines it, has always existed, which means that he's not talking about historical Freemasonry, right? That is just a stand-in. That's a conversation starter for this dialogue. But the goal of the dialogue is to get you to recognize the necessity of some kind of order, some kind of organization, some kind of forum where people who are broad-minded can come together to mediate the conflicts that inevitably arise from the more narrow, particular partisanships and duties that we all have. And he says it would be contrary to the health of the state, it's contrary to the good, contrary to one's duties, to simply lose any sense of particular obligation, right? He thinks the idea of a citizen of the world is an absurdity, right? Yet at the same time, he recognizes that even if you are a passionate advocate for the interests of your own people, you have to have a way of looking out for larger goods. And I think that within the European nationalist world, we are constantly faced with a struggle between a common interest that we all have as European people and the petty differences that divide us. I'm a hair trigger censor in the comments section at Countercurrents. And the reason why I do that is because if you allow uncensored discussion in any nationalist forum, there's always a troll, and they're usually working for the enemy, but sometimes they're just a little drunk, and they're members of our particular general community, who will go in there and say, you know, we all need European unity, and we could have that if it weren't for the bloody Irish or something. And they just destroy the whole thing like that. And then people are fighting them, you know, it's the English versus the Irish all over again. We're back in the 17th century. It's terrible. It's terrible. We have to get over that, right? And what Lessing is putting forward is basically an idea that since there are broad-minded people who can see past particular interests when they come into conflict with one another, there needs to be a framework, a forum where these people can come together and mediate conflicts so that the real diversity in the world can flourish within borders rather than basically consume itself through strife. And that's what Lessing described as an ideal Freemasonry, and it's an inherently conservative kind of Freemasonry. So I'm going to skip ahead because I want to leave more time for questions and other speakers. Now there are a couple of comparisons that I think are really useful here. There's a Turkish notion. There's an actual 20th century Turkish contribution to political thought. I was pleased to know this. It's called the idea of the deep state. And it's been elaborated by Turkish journalists and activists on the left or in the Islamist community. And basically what they describe is this. They say that there's a deep state within Turkey that is a covert network centered in the military and the intelligence services, but extending into the judiciary, the business sector, and even elements of organized crime, and overlapping with the crypto-Jewish community known as the Donme. And the purpose of this deep state is to prevent any challenges to the Kemalist order, the secular Turkish state set up by Ataturk. And there have been times when the parliament has been paralyzed, or left-wing terrorism is upsetting things, or Kurdish separatists or Islamists have been creating trouble, and the military has stepped forward to suspend the constitution basically for a period of time to preserve the Kemalist order. Okay? This notion of a deep state is a kind of Freemasonry that operates within the country of Turkey specifically. And I think that, of course, for Lessing, what he thinks of Freemasonry really should be is not just a deep state for one nation, but in a sense the deep state for the whole world. Because there are global problems, especially when you start getting into environmental issues. These really are global problems that need global solutions. And how is that going to be affected? Well, within our particular European culture, we need a forum whereby the most broad-minded among us can speak with the most broad-minded members of other European groups, so that we can keep our eye on our common good, the higher good of our race and our civilization, and mediate disputes that inevitably arise. We need that. And for the world to survive with its differences intact, there needs to be a way that the most broad-minded among us can speak to the most broad-minded among them, meaning the other civilizational blocks. This is what Lessing describes as a conservative Freemasonry, because the goal is to, again, preserve real differences rather than allow them to be consumed in strife. So where do we start? If Lessing is right, then whenever broad-minded people gather to discuss the welfare of the world, Freemasonry is afoot. So don't ask, when do we start? Because we're already here and we already have. So that's basically his argument.
Greg talked about the deep states. The deep states. Well, there is a deep state, and we all know who it is. And I'll read you a quote from Greg Johnson's article, Metapolitics and Occult Warfare. Peoples who lack a sense of destiny tend to become the playthings of peoples who have a sense of destiny. We are tired of being playthings. Yes. We need to rediscover our sense of destiny. We need white moral rearmament. So let's rearm our people and let us fight back and let us win. And leading the way is the founder and director of Countercurrent's website, Greg Johnson.